After 2 months of interviews and consultations, the World Trade Organization's General Council has finally made its final choice and recommended Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala of Nigeria as its next Director General. By doing so, Okonjo-Iweala would become the first woman and first African to lead the WTO. The WTO has called for a meeting on November the 9th after U.S. presidential election to discuss the issue because the U.S. has denied the recommendation. Can the U.S. unilaterally stall the WTO chief's appointment? So what damage would this bring to the world? Let's ask our panelists from China, the U.S., and the European continent. For the discussion on WTO's chief's appointment, joining us in Washington, D.C., Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Long time no see. Good to see you again, Jeffrey. In Beijing, Adam Dunnett, Secretary General of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. Good to see you, Adam. Last but not least, in Beijing, Li Yong, Senior Fellow from the China Association of International Trade. Mr. Li, good to see you. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Schott, about the latest discussion regarding the WTO appointment. Tell me, why do you think the current administration is blocking, or rather disagree with the proposal?
Well, the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer issued a statement and said that he strongly favored the South Korean trade minister because she has experience in trade negotiations, and he feels she is the most qualified. Both the remaining candidates are very well qualified. But what seems odd is that the selection process, could not come up with a consensus and yet still announce that they had a clear favorite. That's what I think has thrown the decision-making process into turmoil.
Mr. Li, according to some media reports, the latest dispute about the future selection has a lot to do with China. Well, everything these days in the story has something to do with China, but Mr. Li, what is your take about these kinds of rhetorics in the media reports?
Probably has something to do with China, but basically I don't think China is the main or the only reason for the U.S. to block the nomination. And obviously, you know, this Nigerian finance minister, you know, actually she has dual citizenship. She is actually holding the U.S. citizenship. But you know, on the other hand, she seems to be a kind of a doer, supporting strongly the WTO's multilateral system. And he specifically said the multilateral trading system is good for the world, and she doesn't want to see, or she wants to see less of bilateral spat that we see. So because of her position, and because also her focus on the African, the development of African development, probably this is not in line with the U.S. Idea of changing the trajectory of the WTO, you know, into the direction of what U.S. wanted to have.
Interesting. So, Mr. Dennett, what about from the European side? I know you are representing the European Chamber of Commerce here in China. When you're talking to your business friends, what do they have to say about the latest debate?
Well, the European Commission and all of the member states have all unanimously backed Dr. Ngozi. They think she'd be a strong candidate, should be the first female, both would be the first female Director General of the WTO, but it'd be the first African Director General of the WTO. So they think that would be very good for EU-African relations. But she, unlike her counterpart, she's got a much wider experience. She's an expert in development economics, and she's got a strong finance and customs background. And so She's certainly the outsider in this case. She doesn't have the trade experience that her counterpart does in terms of trade negotiations and all that. But both very strong candidates, and as I think one of the other panelists said earlier, she's probably more likely to shake things up. But the concern about her pro-trade tendencies could perhaps be the concern for the U.S. that's done a lot of work recently in raising issues that it's not satisfied within the WTO.
So the question fundamentally is whether it is about her or it is about a vision for the World Trade Organization and the potential of global trade, Mr. Shah.
Well, clearly both of the candidates believe in a very strong multilateral trading system. So there's no difference between them. And the Korean trade minister, her hero is Carla Hills, who was the former U.S. trade representative, who was one of the strongest supporters of the multilateral trading system. So I think what the problem is that the Trump administration has a very peculiar view of what it wants to do. And they may be in office for the next 4 years, or they may be out of office by January 20th. And so having reached a decision before the U.S. election was very, very odd and was a big mistake by the ambassadors in charge of building the consensus process. And indeed has led to the big mess that we're in now, that nobody knows what to do and what is going to happen next week and in the coming weeks. It's a big mess, but it has nothing to do with favoring a candidate because of support for the multilateral system. They're both superb.
Politics are always complicated, especially the U.S. election politics, but the rest of the world need to and have to bear that in mind. Mr. Lee, on the other hand, there are a lot of urgent issues that WTO needs to handle. We know there are layers of issues, from technical issues to the governance and structural issues. So, Mr. Lee, from now until the election, the next administration coming in, whether it's the same or a different one, all this time, how should we handle some of the thorny issues already on everybody's top agenda?
You know, without the successful appointment of the Secretary General into the position, I don't think the WTO can do anything. And that is, I think, the reason why, you know, for the second time, the U.S. is blocked. One of the main actions that WTO is going to take. You know, the first one is the refusal to appoint, you know, new members to the appellate body. Which almost has crippled the dispute settlement mechanism. And this time, I think if there's no agreement, because, you know, the whole process requires consensus, you know, across the 140 members, theoretically, you know, one single country can block the process. And that, I think, it is going to bring to the eventual voting system. So before, you know, I don't think it has really something to do with the upcoming election, but whoever is going to be in the White House probably is going to make a little difference, but I don't really expect that, because, you know, whoever is in the office is, you know, they are going to handle the burning issues domestically and some of the major international issues, whether WTO is going to be on top of the agenda, because, you know, for the Americans to make a compromise on their decision is going to be a very, you know, complicated and difficult process.
Right. Interesting. Mr. Dennett, on the other hand, so will WTO be able to play its role for the foreseeable future? And what does that mean for the Europeans?
It's a good question, Tianwei. I mean, let's be clear that the challenges WTO facing is not just with the Trump administration. This started 15 years ago with the lack of completion of the Doha round. On the one hand, the good news is everybody agrees that the WTO needs to be reformed. On the other hand, the bad news is everybody's definition of what that reform entails is quite different, a bit like China in that regard. But there are some areas perhaps that we can find some commonality amongst ourselves, and I think for anybody coming into this role, what you need to do is look towards the low-hanging fruit and look for small wins to move this organization forward, because otherwise I think you may end up with many bilateral agreements like the EU has been doing. They haven't been sitting idle during this paralysis that the WTO has been going. They've been signing deals with Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and even talking with China on an investment deal right now.
Right. And how is that doing?
Well, politically, on the investment deal, the comprehensive agreement on investment, the leaders of the EU and China have agreed to try and strive for a political agreement at least by the end of this year. It's been 7 years and 30 rounds in the process, but if that could be signed, I think that would send a strong message to the rest of the world that we need to move forward, and EU and China are prepared to do so.
Mr. Schott, I know you go beyond the national politics, and you are one who really have been looking at the international trade system and been working on it. Tell me more about what can we expect structural-wise, international, more bilateral and smaller size regional multinational frameworks. Will WTO still be relevant in the foreseeable future? And what can be the role of the U.S., which administration coming in office, and vis-a-vis its relations with China, with the Europeans? There are major trading partners.
A lot depends on the U.S. election. Because a Biden administration would be quite different from the Trump administration in terms of what it wants to do and how it does it in terms of pushing WTO reform. A Biden administration would seek to strengthen the WTO system and other multilateral, other international organizations, but it would do so in cooperation with our trading partners. And that is something that is a little different from what the Trump administration has done. It's put forward reform proposals, but it's always been, this is the way we want to do it, and it's our way or the highway, or we'll leave. So I think the U.S. election makes a big difference. There are a lot of advisors to Vice President Biden who have experience and have put forward proposals for rebuilding the appellate body and strengthening the dispute settlement system, and have putting forward ideas for areas of reform in the WTO. But your point is well taken. Not all of the initiatives necessarily will be in Geneva. Some of them will take place in plurilateral initiatives, like we are already seeing with regard to digital trade and environmental goods. Some will take place in broader regional initiatives, like has occurred in Asia with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And we could see an expansion and revival of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I know the United Kingdom has been talking about potential entry into it, and China has been thinking and studying that possibility for a long time as well. A Biden administration, I think, would begin to move the United States back into the Asia-Pacific region and also revisit the TPP. So there are a lot of different ways that the process can rebuild, but I think the Biden administration would put a priority on rebuilding and rebuilding better.
Does China, for example, Mr. Li, which is also a very important part of the WTO international trade platform, believe in a new administration in the U.S. would make a huge difference?
The basic perspectives about what Biden would like to do in terms of reforming the WTO, but the current problem issue that the Trump administration has with the new nominee is, quote unquote, they have even no multilateral tariff negotiations. There's kind of no transparency, and I think it is interesting to really understand why EU has supported the new new nomination because she had a clear priority list on her agenda if she was appointed the Secretary General. For example, the special treatment differentiation, industrial subsidies, and also dispute settlement reform, which has been one of the issues that U.S. has with WTO, and then the rest would be resolving the issues of fishery, e-commerce, and health. And obviously, Dr. Ngozi, she has a clear mind in terms of where the WTO should go. And in terms of regional development, I think China's focus right now is RCEP, without ruling out the possibility of joining other regional initiatives. But I think the focus really is, to make sure that the multilateral system is going to continue to work, to function, and to help the world trade, because no other regional blocks, whatever it is going to have the kind of a global reach. So WTO is essentially very important, or more important than the regional agreements.
Mr. Dennett, I'm sure you've been listening to your two other colleagues very closely. The name of Europe has been completely mentioned in both their answers. Your take?
I think the EU would really like to support the African candidate because of its history, relations, and what she represents in terms of balance and bringing vigor into the WTO system. All of the other issues, e-commerce is obviously an issue that companies around the world are very concerned about. It's undermining retailers, and so we'd like to see that tackled. The fisheries issues, we've seen progress on that, so that's something that I think could be a low-hanging fruit for her. The dispute settlement mechanism, if the predictions about the U.S. election, about Biden getting in are correct, then I have a strong feeling that as part of his multilateral engagement in other areas, that he'd come back and probably support her as well. And I think one of the failures of the WTO is everybody thought the world would sort of converge in the 25 years since it's been created, but we've seen that there's many different economic systems around the world, and people are I think, again, a large part of the Trump administration's response to the WTO has been a reflection of how it sees the world not converging and not having the same value-based system that it and other countries have as well. So there's a long history to why the WTO is facing the challenges that it is.
Now, many suggest it is not a coincidence that the U.S. has produced a very unique president. It's also not a coincidence that we see an election that could be very intense, which means there could be support for both camps and different ways of looking at the world within the United States. So how long do you think, Mr. Schott, can people expect really the U.S. come to reconciliation within itself and to come up to a consensus within itself about how it looks at itself, how it approaches the world? This time I want to ask you from a trade perspective, because it's not fair to ask you from a politics perspective. Mr. Schott.
Well, interestingly, Martin Wolf and I were on a panel last weekend at the Bund Summit in Shanghai, and we were talking about this very concern, that regardless of what happens in the election, there's going to continue to be deep divisions in U.S. politics, and that will spill over and lead to continued frictions in U.S.-China trade relations. Now, how does that affect operations in the WTO? To be very clear, to get anything done in the WTO, the major trading powers have to be able to work together. Not necessarily agree on everything, but to cooperate with each other. And so for the United States and China, we have to work together. We have to find areas where we can make progress and avoid political roadblocks. One of the areas would be in the area of climate change. The trading system needs to be retooled to address, at least help contribute to the issue of climate change. Subsidies are part of the issue. Regulatory issues are another. Another issue is access to medicines. The pandemic has underscored the need to have common disciplines, in the United States and China and Europe need to be working together on that. And a final issue, Dennis mentioned the issue of subsidies. Well, dealing with broad-based subsidy reform is very difficult today. I can tell you I did it 40 years ago, and I wrote some of the international trading rules on subsidies on a broad level. But today, I think the world is much more complex, and we have to focus on sectors.
Yeah.
And one of the sectors that the United States and Europe and China should be working on is aircraft subsidies. It's not just a Boeing and Airbus problem anymore. China has a big stake and has been deploying subsidies in this area. And it's one area where the three could get together and help push a positive subsidy agenda in the WTO that actually has a chance of success.
It's always a fascinating discussion, gentlemen. Just think about all the moving factors for every issue that we've been discussing. Absolutely fascinating. For now, I want to thank for your expertise and also your insights joining us for this discussion. Jeffrey Schott, Adam Dennett, and Lee Yung, wherever you are, be safe and be sound. I hope to see you soon.